She asked the same question over and over, thinking she could force Karoline into a trap, but by the time Karoline was done, the entire press room had turned against her. The room felt charged, the kind of tension that didn't need to be spoken to be understood. Reporters filled every row, cameras locked in place, and the quiet hum of whispered conversations filled the air, right until the press secretary stepped aside, signaling the start of the briefing. Karoline Levitt, sharp in both presence and words, took the podium. She didn't need to adjust the microphone, her voice would carry just fine. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her gaze scanning the room. "I know you have questions, so let's get started." A flurry of hands shot up. The usual suspects, the ones who'd been in these briefings long enough to know how the game was played. But among them was one particular journalist, Hannah Whitmore, a name known not just for her reporting, but for her relentless questioning of conservative figures. Karoline already knew what was coming. "Ms. Levitt," Hannah called, flashing the kind of practiced smile that never reached the eyes. "There have been rising concerns about right-wing extremism. Would you take a moment to denounce it?" A question designed not to inform but to corner. Karoline didn't react immediately. She didn't need to. Instead, she allowed the weight of the question to settle in the air, her pause calculated, controlled. Hannah wasn't finished. "Surely you acknowledge that this is a growing problem in our country, that this administration has been slow to respond." Karoline tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Are you asking me to condemn political violence?" Hannah's smirk flickered just for a second. "Yes, specifically from right-wing groups. Will you take a stance against it here and now?" That was the trick, the framing, the carefully worded setup that ensured any answer could be twisted. Say yes and it becomes an admission that her side is responsible. Say no and it's headline material. Levitt refuses to condemn extremism. The room held its breath. This was the moment journalists live for. But Karoline didn't give her an easy win. "You know what's interesting, Hannah?" Karoline finally said, her voice even, sharp. "You've been at this podium how many times now? A dozen? More? And yet I don't recall you asking a single question about left-wing violence. Not one." A ripple of whispers moved through the press pool. Cameras zoomed in just a little closer. Hannah let out a tight laugh, leaning forward in her seat. "I don't think that's a fair—" Karoline didn't let her finish. "Last week, a sitting judge was targeted outside his home. Not a single network ran a headline about it. 2 months ago, a conservative student was beaten unconscious for wearing a political hat. I didn't see a press panel on that either." Hannah's smile thinned. "We're talking about the rise of—" Karoline raised a hand slightly, cutting her off. "No, Hannah, you're talking about selective outrage. Let's not pretend this is about condemning violence. If it were, you'd be asking these questions when it's politically inconvenient for you." The murmurs grew louder. A few reporters exchanged glances, some looking down at their notes. Hannah opened her mouth, but this time she hesitated. Karoline leaned forward, hands resting on the podium. "You came here today thinking you had a checkmate, but the truth is, people are tired of this game, and they see right through it." But that wasn't the end of it. Hannah wasn't done yet, and she wasn't about to let Karoline take control of the room without a fight. "So let me ask you again," Hannah pressed, her voice a little sharper now. "Do you condemn right-wing extremism, yes or no?" The air tightened. The next few seconds would determine everything. But Karoline wasn't just going to answer, she was going to make sure everyone in that room remembered what came next. The silence stretched just long enough to make Hannah Whitmore shift in her seat. The press room was watching, waiting for Karoline to squirm, to stumble, to hesitate. But she didn't. Instead, she gave a slow nod, acknowledging the persistence of the question, but not in the way Hannah had hoped. "I understand what you're trying to do," Karoline said, her tone even, controlled. "You want a soundbite. You want a headline that fits neatly into a narrative. But let me make one thing clear. I will not play along." A few reporters exchanged glances. A murmur passed through the room. Hannah's jaw tightened. "It's a simple yes or no question, Ms. Levitt." Karoline didn't blink. "No, it isn't, and you know that." Hannah leaned forward slightly, her voice laced with mock patience. "So, are you refusing to condemn—" Karoline exhaled sharply through her nose. "Stop right there. She held up a hand, not rudely, but with just enough authority to halt the reporter mid-sentence. I condemn all political violence, but what you're doing is something entirely different. You're asking me to only condemn one side, and that's where the problem lies. A few seats down, another journalist scratched something in his notebook. A cameraman adjusted his angle. The tension thickened. Hannah scoffed, tilting her head in disbelief. So you refuse to acknowledge the role of right-wing groups in extremist violence? Karoline's eyes sharpened. Let me ask you something, Hannah. When was the last time you sat in this room and asked a Democrat politician to denounce left-wing violence? Hannah blinked. Karoline didn't wait for an answer. When a man tried to assassinate a Supreme Court justice, did you come to this podium and demand accountability from the left? When federal buildings were torched during protests, did you press for condemnation? Or do you only find your voice when it serves a particular agenda? Hannah's smirk faltered, but she recovered quickly. I'm here to ask the questions, not answer them. Karoline let out a short laugh, shaking her head. Exactly, because if you did answer them, you'd have to admit that this isn't about truth, it's about control. It's about who gets to be labeled dangerous and who gets a free pass. The press room shifted. Some reporters glanced toward each other, sensing that this wasn't going as planned for Hannah. A few cameras zoomed in, capturing her discomfort, but she wasn't done. She wasn't going to let Karoline flip the script without pushing back. You keep bringing up left-wing violence, Hannah said, her voice tight with irritation. But statistics show that incidents attributed to right-wing extremism have been on the rise. Are you denying those numbers? Karoline let out a slow breath, measuring her words carefully. Statistics, she repeated, numbers collected and categorized by organizations that often refuse to classify riots, attacks on conservatives, and threats against justices as political violence at all? Do you really think people don't notice that? Do you really believe Americans don't see the hypocrisy? Hannah opened her mouth, then closed it. But since we're talking about facts, Karoline continued, her voice steady, let's talk about another one. Just last week, a man was arrested for attempting to assassinate a political figure in broad daylight. It barely made the headlines. If the roles were reversed, we'd be having a very different conversation right now, wouldn't we? The room stilled. Hannah sat back slightly, clearly calculating her next move. I'm simply trying to get an answer to a very simple question, she insisted, though her confidence had waned. No. You're trying to force an answer that fits your narrative, and I won't give you that. Another ripple moved through the room, more whispers. A few reporters suddenly found their notepads very interesting. Hannah's composure was slipping. She knew she was losing control of the moment, but she wasn't about to go down without one final attempt. Hannah exhaled, her frustration barely concealed. The cameras were still rolling, and she wasn't about to let this moment slip away. She adjusted in her chair, her tone growing sharper. So you're saying there's no issue with right-wing extremism? That these incidents we've seen over the past few years don't matter? Karoline shook her head. That's not what I said, and you know it. She let a brief pause linger before continuing, her voice steady, unshaken. You want me to frame this as if there's one side that's always guilty and the other side that's always innocent. That's dishonest. That's why people don't trust the media anymore. The words hung in the air. A few reporters in the room looked up at that, knowing there was truth in what she had just said. Hannah let out a short, clipped laugh. People don't trust the media because of misinformation and conspiracy theories spread online. Karoline raised an eyebrow. Really? You don't think the selective coverage, the blatant double standards, the outright suppression of certain stories has anything to do with it? She let out a small sigh, shaking her head. Tell me, Hannah, where was the national outrage when sitting lawmakers encouraged protests that turned into riots? Where were the journalists demanding accountability when businesses burned, when police stations were set on fire, when people were attacked in the streets for wearing the wrong hat? The murmurs in the room grew louder. Hannah pursed her lips, struggling to regain control. I'm here to talk about the facts, she snapped. Karoline didn't flinch. No, you're here to shape a narrative. If you really cared about facts, you'd be asking why some violent acts are amplified endlessly, while others are swept under the rug. Hannah scoffed. So, now you're accusing the media of covering up violence. Karoline held her gaze. I'm stating what everyone already knows. The media decides what matters and what doesn't. The media decides which attacks become national crises and which ones are ignored, and the public sees it. A few seats away, another reporter cleared his throat, as if suddenly uncomfortable. The room felt heavier now. The conversation no longer just a debate between Karoline and Hannah, but a reflection of something much bigger. Hannah tried one last time. Miss Levitt, you still haven't answered the question. Do you or do you not condemn right-wing extremism? Karoline's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. She leaned forward slightly, resting her hands on the podium. I condemn all political violence. But the fact that you keep asking this in one direction and one direction only is exactly why people don't take this conversation seriously anymore. A sharp, cutting silence filled the room. Hannah opened her mouth, then hesitated. She had pushed, she had pressed, but she had lost control of the moment. Karoline exhaled, glancing around at the other reporters. Anyone else have a question, or are we going to keep pretending that this is an honest conversation? A few hands lowered. Some reporters avoided eye contact. Hannah's face was tight, her frustration barely contained, but she wasn't the only one struggling now. The entire press corps had just been put on notice, and the story was no longer about Karoline dodging a question. It was about how the media had just been exposed on live television. The silence in the room was loud. Cameras zoomed in, microphones picked up the faint shuffling of papers, and the weight of Karoline's words still hung in the air like an undeniable truth no one wanted to acknowledge. Hannah Whitmore, who had started this exchange so confidently, sat stiffly in her chair, her fingers tightening around the pen in her hand. She wasn't used to losing control of an interview, and she certainly wasn't used to being the one under scrutiny. Another reporter, Daniel Vaughn, a senior correspondent from a major network, cleared his throat, attempting to shift the conversation. Ms. Levitt, if I may— But Hannah wasn't done. She straightened, forcing a controlled smile. I just find it interesting that you're refusing to give a direct answer. Karoline exhaled softly, then let out a small chuckle. You know what's actually interesting, Hannah? She leaned forward slightly. The fact that I've answered you at least 3 times, and yet you keep rewording the same question, hoping I'll say something you can twist into a headline. A few people in the press pool exchanged quick glances. Hannah's jaw clenched, but she wasn't going to back down. I'm simply doing my job. Karoline's smile didn't waver. Your job isn't to trap people, it's to report the truth. The room shifted. Some reporters scribbled notes, others just watched. Even the ones who didn't necessarily agree with Karoline could sense what was happening. Hannah inhaled sharply. You're deflecting. Karoline tilted her head. No, I'm exposing the game you're playing, and from the way the room is reacting, I'd say they see it too. A slight murmur rippled through the press corps. The balance of power in the room had shifted entirely. Hannah knew it, and the frustration was written all over her face. Daniel Vaughn saw the moment, stepping in smoothly. Ms. Levitt, if I could change gears for a moment. Hannah whipped her head in his direction, eyes narrowing slightly. She had worked too hard to let this slip away. Actually, I'd like to finish my question, she interjected, her voice laced with forced politeness. Karoline gave a knowing smile. Of course you would. She took a brief pause, then gestured toward her. Go ahead, Hannah, one last time, let's hear it. The challenge was obvious. The room was watching, waiting to see if Hannah would try again, if she would dig in or finally let it go. Hannah straightened her posture. Do you condemn right-wing extremism? Karoline period. And if you actually cared about this issue, you would too. Silence. Hannah opened her mouth, but nothing came out. A few cameras zoomed in on her, waiting for a response, a retort, something, anything, but she had nothing. Karoline let her sit in the silence for a moment longer before finally leaning back. Are we done here? Daniel Vaughn, sensing the moment slipping from Hannah's grasp, jumped in immediately. Miss Levitt, moving on. And just like that, Hannah was out. She sat back, her face tight, her frustration boiling just beneath the surface. She had pushed, she had prodded, but in the end, she had been left exposed. And worst of all, she knew the cameras had captured every second of it. But the real damage wasn't just to her, it was to the entire narrative. The air in the press room had changed, no one could deny it. The usual rhythm of controlled questioning and calculated responses had been shattered. The narrative had slipped through Hannah's fingers, and Karoline had taken control in a way that left the entire room feeling unsteady. Hannah sat stiffly, her lips pressed together, her notepad suddenly less of a weapon and more of a prop. The cameras were still rolling, broadcasting her humiliation to the world in real time, but Karoline wasn't done yet. She turned slightly, scanning the faces in the room. Some reporters shifted in their seats, avoiding eye contact. Others looked at her with newfound caution. "You know," Karoline began, her voice measured, "this isn't just about me standing here today. This isn't just about Hannah asking a loaded question. This is about a pattern of selective outrage, selective reporting, and selective accountability." Hannah let out a breath, shaking her head slightly. "So now you're attacking the press as a whole?" Karoline smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "I don't have to. The public already sees what's happening." A few reporters looked up at that, knowing exactly what she meant. "Let's talk about recent history," Karoline continued, her tone even but firm. "When protests turned into riots that destroyed entire city blocks, where was the outrage? When violent activists targeted Supreme Court justices' homes, where were the urgent questions? And when a sitting member of Congress called for unrest in the streets, where were the demands for condemnation? Silence." Hannah glanced toward one of her colleagues as if expecting someone else to step in, but no one did. They were all waiting, watching, absorbing. "And let's not forget," Karoline pressed, "just last month a journalist from this very press pool dismissed an act of violence against a conservative lawmaker as not politically motivated enough to be worth covering. But here you all are today, eager to push a one-sided narrative because it fits the version of reality you prefer." A few murmurs rippled through the room. The tension thickened. Daniel Vaughn, sensing the shift, adjusted his tie and cleared his throat. "Miss Levitt, are you suggesting that media biases—" Karoline didn't let him finish. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating a fact." A beat of silence. "You see, the difference between me and many of you in this room is that I don't pretend objectivity exists where it doesn't," Karoline continued, her voice never rising but cutting through the room like a knife. "The public is smarter than you give them credit for. They know the game's being played. They see the double standards. And no amount of rehearsed questions, selective outrage, or cherry-picked headlines will change that." Hannah's fingers clenched around her notepad. "If you don't trust the media, why are you standing here addressing us?" Karoline let out a small chuckle. "Because I do trust the people watching this." The answer landed. The room shifted. Hannah knew she had lost. She had walked in thinking this would be another predictable exchange, another chance to trap a conservative official into saying something that could be manipulated. But instead, she had become the story. And the worst part? The footage was already spreading. A producer in the back of the room was scrolling through social media, watching the video clips rack up thousands of views per minute. Karoline glanced toward the cameras, her expression calm, composed. "I think we're done here." And just like that, she stepped back from the podium. The press briefing wasn't officially over, but the moment was, and now, the real fallout was about to begin. The press room remained frozen, even after Karoline Levitt stepped away from the podium.